So please bear with me because I haven't done a talk in a long time. No clapping. No clapping for that. All right. Okay, so I just want to give you guys a little background on Luke. So our study is a study of Jesus. But it's always important to understand context. So before we go through this journey through the Gospel of Luke, I just want to look at Luke, who he was, and why he chose to write an account of Jesus' life and ministry. So please keep in mind, none of the things I say can probably be proven, but I have done deep dives, and there are a lot of theologians and historians and scholars who can back up what I am saying, and if there are different accounts, I will try to add that as well. So before we actually look at Luke, let's just take an overview of the Gospels. So when people say gospel, they're talking about Jesus' life and ministry. And there are 4 books in the Bible that recorded this: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. So the English term gospel comes from Old English, Godspell, which is a Greek noun, euangelion. So euangelion means good news, which eventually came to be what Christians use as a term for the good news of Jesus Christ. So the gospel writers wrote historical events, and they were theological documents through the narrative of Jesus' life. So the gospels were to instruct and encourage believers and also convince non-believers. So when we pick up a newspaper, we know we're going to read the news. You pick up a tabloid, you know you're going to read gossip. You pick up a novel, you know you're going to read a good fictional story. So that is why it's also important to know what type of literature we're reading when it comes to the books in the Bible too, specifically in the Gospels. So 2 of the gospel writers, John and then Luke, state their intentions explicitly. So it leaves no doubt that Luke intended to write history, which we're going to look at in just a minute here. I want to tell you a little story. This past Christmas, I got my husband the 23andMe kit. I know people are like, oh, that's going to get sold to a third party. It's fine. We don't care. So reason being, his maternal grandfather, we had been told probably has Native American blood in it, and which totally makes sense. We are from South Dakota, and he's a lot darker than his European heritage from his mom's side, being 100% German, and then his paternal grandmother is Norwegian. The thing is that no matter what my husband finds out, it doesn't change who he is. He's still a caring husband, a loving father, really hard worker, and he's still son of the king. So when we learn about who Luke is, that also doesn't change what we know about Jesus. It just gives us a little history into our faith and the ancestors who wrote our faith and recorded what was happening at the time. So now when we look at Luke, the earliest and unanimous traditions of the Christian church say that the books of Luke and Acts were in fact written by who we know as Luke the physician. Luke was a Greek. He's the only non-Jewish gospel writer. Actually, he's the only Gentile writer in the whole Bible. He also wrote the book of Acts. So he is the only writer that also has a sequel. That's a gospel writer. Other ones have a sequel, but gospel writer has a sequel. So Luke wrote this story of the life, death, resurrection of Jesus, and then goes right into building the early church. He wrote them at the same time, but we have them separate in our modern Bible. Luke does not specifically name himself in either one of those books, but Paul mentions him by name in 3 different books. It is presumed that Paul mentions the same person that wrote the books. When he says Luke, we can assume that it's Luke from the Gospel of Luke. So let's get a better idea of what those say to get a better idea of who Luke is. So in Colossians 4:14, It says, Luke, the beloved doctor, sends his greetings. This tells us that Luke seemed to be close enough to Paul for Paul to say the beloved doctor. It also kind of gives us maybe the impression that Luke's interest in medicine, maybe the reason he has a lot about Jesus' healings, possibly. Again, nothing can be proven. Then Philemon 1:24, Paul says, Luke, my fellow coworker. So in Philemon 1, Paul is imprisoned, and in verse 23 and 24, he mentions a few of his coworkers. One, he mentions that he's my fellow prisoner, and then he lists the other ones, including Luke. So assume that Luke was not imprisoned with him then. And then in 2 Timothy 4:11, he says, Luke alone is with me. I can assume if they were together that they had gotten to know each other pretty well. So then the second half of the book of Acts, Luke switches his writings from third person to actually first person on occasion, indicating that Luke was traveling with Paul when he was writing this as well. These are called the we statements. Has anyone heard of the we statements? Okay, good. Okay, that means I get to teach some. Okay, so if we look at Acts 16:10, it says, so we decided to leave Macedonia at once, having concluded that God was calling us to preach the good news there. So this would have been about 49 AD during Paul's second journey. And then next we have Acts 20:5 and 6. They went ahead and waited for us at Troas, but we sailed to Philippi after the Feast of Unleavened Bread, and 5 days later joined the others. So this would have been about 57 AD. This would have been during Paul's third journey. And then at the end of Acts 28:1, he says, once safely on shore, we found out that the island was called Malta. So that would have been about 60 AD, right before Paul's house arrest. So Luke's vivid descriptions of his travels with Paul seem to indicate that he was also well-traveled and well-versed in navigation. Scholars have noted that Luke had outstanding command of the Greek language as well. His vocabulary was extensive and rich. He actually utilized 800 words in the New Testament, found nowhere else. So you have Luke, who is a doctor, familiar with sailing, knowledge of navigation and geographic locations, but his writing style also indicated that he was well-educated and observant and a very careful writer. So let's look at the first words that Luke wrote. Luke 1 through 4. Many people have set out to write accounts about the events that have been fulfilled among us. They used eyewitness reports circulating among us from the early disciples. Having carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I've also decided to write an accurate account for you, most honorable Theophilus, so you can be certain of the truths, everything you were taught. So who and why did Luke write this to? The fact is that we do not know who Theophilus is, which there are several theories. But I don't need to really go into that because there's one thing that is for certain, is that we don't know because the Bible doesn't tell us. Theophilus, the word means loved by God. And so it is one idea that it could be that friend of God is just this generic term used for Christians. However, the context is that Luke says most honorable, which is a term that he would have used for someone who was of high honor, high ranking, influential, that he was actually talking to a specific person. There's speculation that it was to someone who was going to be able to spread the gospel through the Roman Empire, or it was someone that was covering the cost of the work that Luke was doing. Again, none of that says in the Bible, so we don't know. But we can assume that it was to a specific person. So he opens his accounts by outlining his eyewitness reports and explaining that he would be reporting facts. He put emphasis on the dates and the details so that we can all believe in the reliability of these accounts. And there's no external evidence, but it is believed that Luke had conversations with Mary, the mother of Jesus. He states a few different things that kind of give us this indication. So in Luke 2:19, says, and his mother kept all these things in her heart. It indicates something that Mary probably would have told him. We have, of course, Mary's song. We have Luke 2:33. Yes, 2:33. The child's father and mother marveled at what was said about him. This was in response to what Simeon had said when they were in the temple. Luke 2:48 says, his mother said to him, son, why have you treated us like this? Your father and I have been anxiously searching for you. She probably would also been the one to tell about Gabriel visiting her, Christ's birth, the visiting magi, their escape to Egypt, so many firsthand accounts. He obviously interviewed a lot of witnesses because he implied this when he says, back in verse 3 or 2, carefully investigated everything from the beginning. Some scholars also say that he could have used the Gospel of Mark as one of his sources as well. Sidebar. So my mom and I always love these stories. My grandma would tell us stories that she passed, obviously, to all of her kids and her grandkids. And now I love to tell my kids from the Great Depression. They're just fascinating. In 1931, my grandmother would have been 8 at the time. At that time, her oldest brother and her mom passed away 3 weeks apart from each other from typhoid, leaving an 8-month-old baby boy, a 3-year-old girl, my grandmother who was 8, and then 4 older siblings. At that time, with no mom in the house and being the Depression, the 4 older siblings all had to work in the farm. No more school, done with that. So it left my grandmother, who was 8 years old, to be responsible and the primary caregiver of a 3-year-old and an 8-month-old. Through the years, as they got a little bit more self-sufficient, then she ended up having to work for another family after school, where she would cook and clean and do their laundry and watch the kids and make their dinner and all that. And she got paid a dime a week for this, and she would have to give that whole dime to her father. And now we don't know exact date of when that happened, but my mother does say it wasn't long after, because my grandma only went to school until 6th grade and she was done. She had to go work on the farm after that. So why am I telling you a story about my grandma? Because these facts are actual. Because we heard them from the eyewitness. She was there. Now, we can't remember the date of when she started helping this other family, but we know it happened. And now that this time has passed, my mom's like, I gotta start writing these down. These facts need to be preserved. And that's what Luke did. If this gospel had not been written by Luke, then this story of Jesus would not have been preserved as these actual factual accounts. So my grandmother's story started in 1931. It's been almost 100 years. It's 2025, folks. It's almost 100 years later. And we still say that's what happened. Because we had the eyewitnesses. So let's look at these eyewitnesses of Luke and when he wrote. Luke likely used his time apart, likely, again, not fact, apart from Paul to be gathering his information from his sources, those people who were there and witnessed the ministry and the death, resurrection. Started writing them in the 50s. Keep in mind, Mary would have only been around 70 at the time. She's still been sharp in remembering things. If you look, if Luke gathered all of that information, he could have been completed around 60 AD, because Paul would have been transferred to that Roman prison at that time. Paul would have arrived in Rome around 60 AD, and Luke mentions him at the end of Acts that he stayed there for 2 years. Paul, along with James and Peter, were all executed in the mid-60s. But Luke never mentions that. So to me, I would think that he probably was done with his writings by then, since he never mentioned it. But on the other hand, Luke does mention Jesus' prophecy of the destruction of Jerusalem in Luke 21. So some scholars do believe that he would have written it after that, because he would have seen that prophecy fulfilled, because the fall of Jerusalem happened in 70. The latest scholars believe that he would have written it were still a century after the death. They say he would have been done, all of that, especially if he used that account of Mark, it would have still been done less than a century. Those first generation witnesses would have still been around. All of this puts that viability to the accurate accounts that Luke added to the gospel. So there's no doubt that our first and only Gentile writer, Luke, his interest in people was undeniable. Much of the material unique to Luke's gospel versus the others is that of Jesus' interactions with individuals. He has all these interactions with people that were considered like on the fringe of the acceptable society. Women, children, tax collectors, sinners. Women were a prominent fixture in the book of Luke. And he also mentions the Samaritans regularly. Okay, so example, Luke recorded the story of Jesus having dinner at Simon the Pharisee's house, and where the woman poured the alabaster jar of perfume on Jesus' feet. Luke points out that to all of those present, all knew this, that this woman was a immoral, sinful woman. But Jesus tells her that her sins are forgiven. In a similar way, we see this story on the cross where Jesus is having a conversation with the thieves that are next to him. One of them is defending Jesus, and Jesus promises him paradise. Luke's portrayal of Jesus is this, our Savior, but he came to minister and show compassion to all people, no matter their situation in life. Offered salvation to all humanity, Jews and Gentiles. Whereas the Gospel of Mark was looking into addressing the synagogue and the Jewish membership. Did I say Matthew? I hope I said Matthew. And then Mark was looking at more of like the Roman Empire. The Gospel of Luke underscores that openness to the church, to the Gentile, to the outsider, to the outcast. He appeals to a broader, more cultural, diverse audience. Now, still, Luke's writing was still to confirm that Christianity was not a new religion. It was a fulfillment of God's promises given in the Old Testament. And Jesus certainly was the Jewish Messiah, but he was also the Savior to the whole world. The church was made up of Jews and Gentiles alike, and it represents the true people of God in this new age of salvation. So I like to think that Luke and everything we've learned about him through our time together as a Gentile was to bring Christ to people who did not know him. His death, his resurrection, his ascension brought forgiveness of sins, not only to Israel, but to all the people who responded to him in faith.